Hello and welcome to Delay in Block Productions here on YouTube. I'm your host, Drayton Blackgrove, and if you've been a long-time subscriber to Delay in Block Productions, this video is going to feel a little bit different. First of all, I'm in front of the camera, and secondly, this is the first episode in a series that I'm calling Abandoned Railways. Today, I am standing at the crest of the world-famous Saluda Grade here in Saluda, North Carolina. It's along a former Southern Railway line. This line hasn't seen a train since 2001, but it's famous for being the steepest mainline railroad grade in the United States, with an average gradient of 4.7%. Mainline trains here face difficulty that wasn't seen anywhere else in North America. You're going to hear some harrowing tales of runaway trains and learn a little bit about the history of this area and how the railroad impacted the community for over a century. Today, we're going to talk with some of the volunteers here at the Saluda Historic Depot Museum and learn about their museum and how they are sharing the history of this amazing stretch of railroad. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy this video, and I'm always looking for suggestions on the next abandoned railway.
In the words of steam locomotive engineer Rich Melvin,
every division we've ever gone to everywhere has the hill. Every division has a hill somewhere that's called the ruling grade. It's the steepest hill on that piece of the railroad. And it's a daily operating obstacle for the railroad running heavy freight trains.
For Western North Carolina, that hill is Saluda Grade. Spanning 2.7 miles from the bottom of the grade at Melrose to the crest at Pace's Crossing in downtown Saluda, the Mountain of Challenge averages an estimated gradient of 4.7%, peaking at 5.1% while gaining an elevation of 606 feet. With the grade rail-banked since 2001, the city of Saluda hasn't seen rail traffic in over 20 years, but the residents of this great community still remember the trains. What was once a bustling mainline railroad between Asheville, North Carolina and Spartanburg, South Carolina, is now a lonely, idle stretch of mountainous railroad. Covered in kudzu with multiple track washouts, Saluda Grade is slowly being reclaimed by Mother Nature.
The Saluda Grade was famous because this 3 miles that starts here and goes up the hill to Saluda is the steepest commercial standard gauge railroad in the country. The last train through here was in 2001. It's been shut down for economic reasons since then. However, for the 120 years that they ran trains up here, it was highly significant because you ended up with old steam engines back in 1878. Which didn't like anything steeper than 2%. This has one section which is reported to be 5.1% and on average 4.7%. And it was surveyed in 1870s by a couple gentlemen. One of them was Thaddeus Coleman and the other one was Captain Pearson. Captain Charles Pearson was the surveyor, and he had an extremely good eye for these mountain lands. And many people, whenever they were trying to get a railroad from Spartanburg to Asheville, would say, follow the Green River up, go up around White Oak Mountain. And he just merely would say, the ground is no good over there. And whenever in the 1970s that they were putting in the interstate highway system, I-26, it was delayed for years to try to figure out how to get that section of mountain to hold just merely an interstate highway system, whereas Captain Pearson 100 years earlier knew the underground flow of the water and the sandstone and could say that land is no good for a railroad. So therefore, for that economic reasons, he chose this. And so then with that kind of challenge, the Saluda Grade became a reality. That was very good for the town of Saluda because Saluda has always had a history of being the gateway to the Blue Ridge. There is what is called the Blue Ridge escarpment through here. So then in this particular lay of land, there is no foothills to wind up. It's almost like coming up a cliff. The town of Tryon is only 10 miles down the track, and Tryon is 1,000 foot lower in elevation than Saluda. And so then they knew when they put the train track in that they were representing a significant challenge to the old steam engines. They did it primarily because they wanted a line from Spartanburg to Asheville. Now, back in the 1870s, railroads were put in by small companies that would get the right to sell stock and then provide track just over a reasonably short section of line. So then this initially started out as the Spartanburg-Asheville Railroad. They got it surveyed, they laid the track, and then they went broke. And so then it became the Asheville-Spartanburg Railroad. The first train up these tracks was in July 4th of 1878. 3 years later, since the railroad always referred to this stretch as going up Saluda Mountain, that the town of Pace's Gap chartered with North Carolina as Saluda. Now, coming up to Saluda, since Saluda was the easternmost point on the Blue Ridge itself, that drovers, people trying to get their goods down to the Piedmont area, would stop in Saluda, and this was the last stop on this train line for the first year. It took them another year to get the train track to Hendersonville. It took them another 10 years to get them to Asheville. So then with the passenger trains coming up to Saluda, you would have people that suddenly realized that if they were from Charleston, say in the summertime, not only can we sleep, but we can also breathe. That continued on. I think the railroad found that people were very interested in the tourism aspects in this area. In fact, there was one special line that was just run from Hendersonville to Highlands to take people strictly to Lake Toxaway. So then it was very important not only to move freight, but also moving people was one of the primary products of this railroad that went through here. Original trains that would come up here, since we're at the bottom of the grade and that they were well aware that this was a significant challenge, would stop here in the non-existent town of Melrose. It's just Melrose Station. But here, that they would put on what's called a helper engine. And the helper engine would go to the rear of the train and help push up the grade. Another way that you could get a longer freight train up the grade would be to split it up and divide it into halves or thirds and take it up a third at a time. Now that went on for a good number of years. In fact, it was even going on in the 1990s. So then if you think of having to split up a train into thirds to make it up the grade, that really is kind of no way to run a railroad. They would run and make it up in fine style, but there was a few problems that could come out. One is if you were trying to make it up the grade and then through mechanical difficulties lost brakes, you could have a runaway coming down through here backwards. A significant one of those occurred in 1903. But one of the primary difficulties was coming down from Saluda and having mechanical difficulties and losing the brakes. That would create coming through this area as a runaway in the neighborhood of 60 to 75 miles an hour. Since the speed limit on the grade was only 8 miles an hour, that was a pretty bad feeling.
Near the turn of the 20th century, larger steam locomotives like the KS 280 consolidation behind me greatly enhanced operational capabilities up the mountain of challenge. Around the 19-teens, heavier 282 Mikado type steam locomotives much like Southern Railway 4501, which is also preserved here at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum, handled much of the traffic up the grade. But it wasn't until the 1930s that Southern Railway's 210-2s, Santa Fe type steam locomotives, handled much of the traffic up the grade. Another one of the exciting steam locomotives seen on Saluda Grade during that time were the heavy 2882 steam locomotives from the LS1 and LS2 class. These heavy articulated steam locomotives handled some of the heaviest trains up Saluda Mountain.
The railroad had the kind of macho image that a good engineer stays with his train, doesn't get off. In Saluda, on this grade, that in the first 25 years of operation that they had lost just under 30 employees based on runaways, and they knew that something had to be done. The railroad became part of the Southern Railroad in 1894, and they were very concerned with the problems of these runaways. They put out what I refer to as an all-points bulletin to their employees saying that we need to enhance the safety of the Saluda Grade or we're going to have to shut it down. Pit Ballou was the engineer on the first wreck of the summer of 1903. He was in the hospital trying to recover from a broken back and came up with the idea that gravity got us into this problem, maybe gravity can get us out. And so then he called in the maintenance supervision in the Southern Railroad and explained to them the concept of a runoff track, a safety runoff track. These were implemented in the same year. When you consider that he came up with the idea in August and they were operational by December, that the Southern Railroad took that suggestion very, very seriously. We are standing at the second runoff track. It happens to be this. It's 1,600 feet long and has a grade up the mountain of between 10 and 11%. Many a train took the runoff track and did not wreck. The primary way that they would signal that, particularly back in the early 1900s, was that here we have a switch house where there would be a switchman standing in that, and as the train came down, 3 blasts on his horn said, "I'm coming in and I am under control." At that time, the guy in the switch house closed the switch to the main line. If there was a miscommunication there, you would end up with the free ride up the runoff track. That went on until the 1950s. 1950s, the diesels were introduced as the prime mover for the railroads. They were more forgiving to the steepness of the grade. Because of that, the Southern Railroad felt that it was safe to pull up safety runoff track number 1, which is 1.5 miles behind me. They did that just fine, but on this one they kept an electronic control on the switch so that if you came through a timing section, which is just 1/2 mile behind me, faster than 8 miles an hour, you automatically went up the runoff ramp. Now there was one train, particularly in 1971, one of the last serious wrecks was a coal train coming down, lost the brakes, out of control, hit the runoff track, and right where we are standing here, 3 of the engines rolled over. But it was enough to move things over such that by the next day that they had the main line operational. And fortunately, there was no one seriously hurt during that wreck. So even in 1971, the safety runoff tracks were doing their thing. And we remind our patrons at the museum that these safety runoff tracks were Saluda's contribution to the interstate highway system just 120 years early.
I know the heart of those engineers. They did not want to give it up. They wanted to conquer it. We learned building highways from railroad curves to line up all of our highways. I actually used them for the first 10 years of my career laying out new highways in Texas. You see these safety tracks that we're standing on, they were the very first. They had to have something in order to keep this functional and operational for the next 100+ years. These become a reality, and the same situation on the highways, we are responsible for trying to minimize not only the impacts to our system, but most importantly to those that use them. So this is a legacy. Number 1 and number 2, safety tracks, now known as runaway ramps.
Saluda Mountain is to be respected, not to be afraid of it, but to be very respectful of it. And we've had 4 runaways that I can remember since 1946. And my father was over there a long time before I was, and he'd tell me about Saluda Mountain and how they used to have to take brake sticks and run it back to the top of the cars back then, you know, and put the brake on for the engineer and slide the wheels on these cars. And you'd see these telephone poles. You'd see a little stick, a hickory stick, tacked up on the side of one of these poles. They'd break a stick, they'd jump off, they'd grab one of them sticks off of that telephone pole, they'd jump back on the train, they'd start winding up brakes again like that with it until you get it stopped or lose it. We've been very lucky with Saluda Mountain. Southern Railway has always respected Saluda Mountain, and we've had the best equipment that you can have, that we have, on Saluda Mountain. And when I say best, it is the best that you can get.
Diesel engines certainly changed a little bit of the landscape of this. That the diesel engine was much more forgiving for the grade. It had primarily 2 reasons. One was there was smoother torque transfer to the wheels and the rail, so you weren't jerking with the force that would try to get the train up, but it was smooth because a diesel locomotive is primarily using DC electric motors to drive the wheels, not steam-powered valving.
I remember the first diesel that came up a mountain. We lived over at Mr. Harley Jones's, and we heard that thing coming up, and it made a different sound, and we couldn't understand what in the world was going on. And I wouldn't have been but about 3 or 4 years old.
I grew up about 90 miles away from Saluda Grade in the 1970s, and I got a driver's license and I had access to a car starting about 1977. And so one of the very first places that I wanted to go was Saluda and to watch the Southern Railway climbing the grade there. Now, I'd grown up, reading stories in Trains magazine and reading John Gilbert's Saluda book. And I kept looking at this and thinking, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And then I realized that it was literally in my backyard, that I could be there in an hour and a half. And so I remember my buddy Jim King in Asheville, North Carolina. He and I would go over there, we'd spend a day, and sometimes we'd get, 2 or 3 trains on the grade and sometimes nothing. And, it was always a dice roll. You never knew. If you got to Asheville and there was something leaving going to the south, you were in great shape because that train was going to go down the hill, get to Spartanburg, turn around, pick up another train, and then come back up. And of course, he'd have to usually triple the hill. So it was a fabulous show. I mean, you're watching these SD40s and SD40-2s and SD35s and 45s, and they're climbing the grade, and the sound is just tremendous. They're just down on their knees, struggling to get up that hill, and they have to do it 3 times. So each time you can go and pick a different spot as they climb from Melrose up to the top of the grade. And it's just a tremendous show. And I always thought the downhill show was really good too, because They would stop up at the grade, they would drape the train across the top of the hill, and then pump up air for a long time before they left. And one of my favorite memories was, I remember there was a train about middle July when the blackberries come into season. And as they were sitting there pumping up air and turning up retainers, the crew goes over and starts harvesting blackberries and having a snack right there on the side of the hillside, just below the top of the grade. And I always thought that was really cool. And it just so happened that another train was passing them, meeting them there, and he was bringing his final cut up the hill. So I took a picture of these two trains passing there at Saluda, and the crew's over on the side, having a nice snack of blackberries. But then you go from there down to Melrose, and of course, it's always you know the train is going to be okay, and it's going to make it. It's not going to go up the safety track. But at the same time, when you first see it coming down the hill, your heart starts racing just a little bit, because there's still that drama. There's still the potential for a runaway on Saluda Grade at any time, because it was such a steep and dangerous piece of railroad. And as it gets a little bit closer and you finally see the switch points of the safety track at the bottom of Melrose move over, and you can kind of breathe a sigh of relief for the crew. And and the fact that you're not going to have to witness a runaway going up the safety track. So it was always a special place to me. Anytime you got to go over to Saluda, it was always great, because like I said, it was a tremendous show going uphill, it was a tremendous show going downhill.
Diesel locomotives greatly enhanced operations both up and down the grade. Thanks to dynamic braking technology, Southern Railway and later Norfolk Southern would be able to handle much longer and heavier trains over Saluda Grade. During the 1970s, when Jim Wren was frequently seen trackside, eastbound Belmont coal trains were normally weighed at 13,500 tons. Truly, there was no other North American railroad quite like Saluda.
The dynamic braking is whenever you are coming down and there's a resistance force, that it can actually be generating electricity, which is removing energy from the system, and help with the braking that was coming through. So dynamic braking and smooth transition of the torque made the diesels more forgiving to the grade. Not completely, but more forgiving. Southern chose to shut down and pull up safety runoff track number 1. Felt that it was not needed. But it was still significant enough challenge, so even towards the end of the operation of the Saluda Grade, that you had in Saluda a man that would get on the train, and he would serve as a harbor pilot to bring the train down the grade.
The Belmont is ready to leave Pace's Crossing, so let's rejoin Melvin Warren for this trip over the Mountain of Challenge.
101 on the higher gauge.
Due to the complex procedures required to operate this train safely down the mountain, I take over the controls here at Pace's Crossing. One of the first things I do is to insert a special key to keep the dynamic brake from releasing should we have an emergency air brake application. Normally, if an emergency would occur, the PC switch would cut out the dynamic brakes. But with this special Saluda key, we can keep the dynamic brake on. This simulated computer graphic shows us exactly what happens when the Belmont goes over the crest. You've got 12,000 horsepower pulling on the head end on a 3.9% downgrade, and you've got over 13,000 tons of coal pulling in the opposite direction on a 1.4% upgrade. This creates some enormous coupler forces, somewhere over 300,000 pounds, right at the crest. So you can see why keeping the Belmont together under these conditions without a train separation demands some real careful handling. When the fourth lead unit passes the crossing, I reduce the throttle to run 7. As every 3 to 4 cars pass the crossing, I gradually notch off the throttle until I finally shut it off.
172 Scaffold faces crossing, 101.
My name is Rick Collins. I was hired on Southern in 1977. In 1998, I was promoted to a road foreman of engines and assigned to the Saluda Mountain Grade. And Melvin Warren was the road foreman on the Saluda Grade. He trained me, which I was really very nervous, but everything worked okay. And I never ever had any problems up on Saluda as long as we practiced the safety that was the standard for Norfolk Southern at that time on the grade. Standing at the top of Saluda and the dissension of the rail was just unbelievable. I could not believe they could run trains down it. We were required to be with every coal train that descended the Saluda Mountain Grade. We had safety measures in place. I would have a vehicle there that was used by the train crew. The road foreman was there just to ensure the safety was complied with and there were no incidents. You had to have a feel and knowledge of what you were doing, and therefore the results was, I never had an incident on the Saluda Grade.
With the arrival of the diesel locomotive in the 1950s and the invention of the dynamic brake, steam locomotives on the Southern Railway system were rendered obsolete. Diesels like the one behind me, Southern Railway SD40 number 3170, greatly enhanced operational safety over the mountain of challenge. In fact, in the 1980s, 3170 was one of the locomotives that operated frequently over Saluda Grade.
The Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum is a nonprofit educational corporation founded in 1963. It is home to the largest collection of former Southern Railway equipment anywhere in the United States, including SD40 3170, the first SD40 purchased by the Southern Railway. The 3170 as an SD40 was well suited for use on Saluda Grade. It was equipped with dynamic braking for stopping trains on the downgrade, and the 6 axles provided extra tractive effort to help get the trains up the hill. Norfolk Southern set aside 2 SD40s for preservation, a Norfolk and Western locomotive and a Southern Railway locomotive. The SD40 3170 came to TVRM as a donation and is still used in service today. Newer locomotives like the 3170, known as a second-generation diesel locomotive, help us educate the public about the transition from steam to diesel and from early diesel to later diesels. Historically, the 3170 has a place in railroad preservation and the steam world that we all follow so closely. It was the locomotive used behind the 611 as it went up Saluda Grade in 1992.
Between the early 1950s and the early 1990s, Saluda Grade didn't see a whole lot of steam. In fact, Southern Railway 4501 visited the grade in the 1970s, but it wasn't until October of 1992 when Norfolk and Western 611, the queen of steam, took on the mountain of challenge. Jim Wren, the editor of Trains magazine, shared with us some of his favorite memories from that amazing weekend in October of 1992.
For a long, long time, there had been a drought of steam on it on Saluda Grade. They hadn't run it for years and years and years because they were a little bit too concerned about it. And then in the late 80s and early 90s, then the attitude started to change, and they started to look at it again, and they really said, we could do this. We'll need diesels for dynamic braking on the way down. But they also realized that they had one of the best 484s that was ever built. And it could race along at 110 miles an hour, but it could also get down on its knees and dig into a grade. Obviously the Norfolk and Western never had anything like Saluda Grade, but they thought it was worth a try. And it was a tremendous day when it took place in October of '92. It was beautiful, gorgeous fall day in western North Carolina. Tons of people around, of course. And you know, they dug right into the grade. I think they had 4 or 5 cars behind 611. They didn't have the canteen because they didn't want the extra weight of the water. So they really carefully planned this out. It took a lot of extra effort. They took 3 6-axle diesels with them to pull the rest of the train. You know, and they did get to one point just below the summit, you know, where they basically stalled out and had to stop. And you know, there was a lot of tense moments there. Everybody was like, okay, are they going to call for the diesels to come and get them or whatever? A lot of people thought they'd be tying down handbrakes. But Bob Saxton was running that day, you know, and Bob got it restarted, and he managed to pull it on up the hill. But it was quite a day, and it was quite a show. An amazing show of power. And you know, when you see 611 and you know it's a 5,000 horsepower 484, when it can only take 5 cars on this hill, that is a show that you know, you never forget. An amazing dream. And you know, those of us that got to see it were really rewarded well.
It was just amazing. They advertised it. I bet you there was not a parking place to be found. There were people everywhere. It was just like having a coon dog festival again. I mean, people were just all over, people taking pictures, just amazed about seeing the 611. And I don't know how many tickets they sold, but they all were sold out. Everybody was just excited to ride the 611. And going down the grade, it was just smooth. You know, we were all talking, having a good time, and you never even knew that you were even moving. And then it get quiet, and you look out, and then you think, this is an experience. And then coming back up is actually when it stalled the last time. And it was like we were sitting there, we thought, we're on the grade and we're stuck, but it's like then all of a sudden it moved. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience.
Well, I went to Saluda very regularly and took train pictures. There's a video that American Alta Vista produced about 611 on Saluda, and I actually provided a number of the clips that are in that video. My girlfriend lived nearby, so we'd get together, and she was also a rail fan. Sort of a funny thing, we were down at Melrose at the beginning of the 611's climb up the grade, and one of the people in the cab saw Wendy and I there and actually invited her up in the cab, so she got to ride 611 up the grade this first time, and I think she had a really good time doing that. She actually showed up in some of the videos that I took and others took, so it was pretty funny. I think she really enjoyed that. I was there in 92 and 93. I wasn't around for the couple of trips that did in 94. The trip in 93, I set myself up to photograph just to the west of Sand Cut. at a location where, if you look at the track charts, it appears to be the steepest point on the grade. I think this particular track chart showed that at 4.8%. But shot a really nice shot. You could hear 611 working its way up to you from further down the grade, up through Sand Cut, and up the grade and around the curve where I shot it at, and just a really, just a pretty thing to watch. I've always been a person who really liked freight operations, and the daily freight operations on Saluda were fascinating. The hang turn, go down in the morning, come back and double or triple or quadruple the train back up the grade, reassemble at the west end of Saluda, and head toward Asheville. Whether it was 3 SD40-2s or SD40s or a couple of high adhesion units like SD70s or C39-8s. The funny thing was there weren't a whole lot of rail fans on Saluda on a normal basis. You didn't see a lot of other people there. You would see some. I had no idea. It makes no sense at all. You would, of course, again, this was back in the 90s. This isn't like today. You know, this is But I don't know. I mean, you know, the proximity of Saluda is not that far from Charlotte. You know, Asheville's right there. You know, not that far from Knoxville or Columbia. I mean, a lot of people you would have thought would have had an interest and could have gotten there pretty easily. Surprisingly, when you put all these tapes together, the videotapes that I had taken, it's over 10 hours of videos of trains going up and down Saluda. There weren't a whole lot of trains on Saluda. There were the Belmont trains and some other coal trains. Maybe some occasional unusual move, but very rarely. But basically on a daily basis, the Hayne turn left, you know, Asheville, went down to Hayne, the yard in Spartanburg, and picked up loaded wood chips and various things and came back up the grade. So empties down and loaded wood chips back up. And again, I don't think it was the steepness of the grade necessarily that caused this to be, but the curvatures and so forth combined with the weight of the cars and so forth. You could bring a train to Melrose, you had to stop the train and break the train up into several cuts. So you have to double, triple, even quadruple the train up the grade, which meant that you had a fascinating period of time where while you just got one train, you went up and down the grade 2, 3, or 4 times. As far as why that grade stayed in service for as long as it did, you had the coal trains like the Belmont train, you had some other coal trains that went down the grade and back up the grade, but the paper mill in Canton, North Carolina, needed wood chips, obviously. That was what you're making the paper process. Well, these wood chips, if you didn't bring them up Saluda, you'd have to go all the way to Salisbury and around. And I think these wood chips came out of South Carolina somewhere in the not too distant vicinity of Asheville. So, you know, these trains, seems like, you know, the major commodity on the Hayne turns were wood chips.
When it comes to America's steepest railroad grades, Saluda is indeed the steepest mainline standard gauge railroad in the United States. However, one other railroad line challenges Saluda in steepness. That railroad grade is the Madison Incline. At just over 7,000 feet, the Madison Incline runs from the Ohio River in downtown Madison, Indiana, to North Madison on an incline of 5.89%. Now, the key difference between the Madison Incline and Saluda is that the incline is much shorter and is essentially a vertical straight shot to North Madison. Saluda is nearly 3 miles of varying grades and cuts between Melrose and downtown Saluda. And the Madison Incline never handled trains longer than about 8 cars. We spoke with Roger Furing of the Madison Railroad to learn a little bit about the history of the mighty Madison Incline.
The Madison Incline is the steepest non-cog grade in North America. It has been in existence since the early 1840s. When they broke ground here originally in 1836, the reason they chose Madison was, as you looked at a map in the State House when they were passing the legislation to build a new railroad, they looked at that map and determined that Madison to Indianapolis was the shortest distance. Madison as a riverfront was considered to be the future of Indiana. It exceeded river traffic more than Cincinnati and Louisville combined at the time. But eventually the incline was the Achilles heel in the railroad.
With a gradient of 5.89%, the incline gorge was an operational nightmare for the railroad, with many derailments and runaways occurring over its long operational history. Much like Saluda Grade, the Madison Incline is now railbanked. Unused since the early 1990s, the incline remains in place, ready for use in case the demand for rail service to downtown Madison ever returns. Plagued by seemingly constant rock slides and washouts, the future for the incline as an active rail line looks very bleak as the grade is slowly being reclaimed by nature. These scenes, taken during the spring of 2019, show the bottom of the grade at Melrose. Where 100 car-long freight trains were once a daily event, Saluda Grade sits silently, void of any rail traffic. Markers of Saluda's once glorious past remain, including signals, trackside signage, the safety runoff track, and the road foreman's office. As we climb the grade from the air, we witness the first washout about a half-mile north of Melrose. Here, heavy water from a seasonal mountain runoff has crippled the integrity of the ballast under the track, causing much of the rock to fall down the mountainside into the valley below. This is one of the more dangerous points along the grade today. During the summer months, kudzu completely covers the tracks, creating an optical illusion that the track bed and ballast are still in place. Since Saluda Grade is still owned by Norfolk Southern, it's technically trespassing to hike up or down the grade. But not only is it a federal crime to hike Saluda Grade, it's extremely dangerous. Delay in Block Productions, along with the Saluda Historic Depot Museum, condemn any form of trespassing on Saluda Grade. Moving further up the grade, a small but steady waterfall streams down the mountainside. Because of rainstorms and rushing water during the spring and summer months, a tree has fallen, creating a domino effect by toppling a smaller tree which has lodged itself into the railroad track below. The miracle tree, as it's referred to by local residents, has pushed out one of the railroad ties and now acts as a natural replacement for the man-made creosote-covered railroad tie that once occupied the track space. About halfway up the grade, we're given an aerial view of Sandcut looking south. One can almost imagine the sound of a Southern Railway 210-2 battling the intense grade at this very spot in the 1940s.
Since 2001, Saluda Grade has essentially been abandoned. Railbanked by Norfolk Southern for economic reasons, the grade faces an uncertain future. But thanks to the folks at the Saluda Historic Depot Museum, the memory of operating on Saluda Grade is preserved for generations to come. With exciting exhibits and events that showcase the history of operations on the grade, we spoke with some of the volunteers as to why it's important to preserve the memory of Saluda Grade.
Well, one of the main things people like to do is actually just walk up Main Street. They like to browse all the unique shops. Most of the shops here carry a lot of American-made crafts. We have art galleries. We have some of the finest restaurants in Western North Carolina. People come from all over Western North Carolina and the upstate of South Carolina to eat at the Purple Onion and the Saya Bistro and the Ward's Grill and the barbecue. People love the Green River barbecue. We have entertainment, especially on Thursday and Saturday nights. During the summer, we have top of the grade concerts, which are the second Friday of each month, and we have performers who you can dance to or just sing along with or just enjoy listening to. So we have a lot of things that go on during the summer on Main Street. M.A. Pace's hardware store is always available and open. It's almost like a museum. It's been there over 100 years, and if you go in there and ask the proprietor for a certain size screw, he'll take you and climb up on a little ladder and go down the shelf and find that screw for you. So there are a lot of things to do. It's a very authentic town. Nothing has changed much here since 1878. As you go through town today and see what's going on, all the activity, all the shops, you won't see any boarded buildings. You won't see any windows with cardboard up on the window. It's because we have a thriving town, and all that was because of the railroad. The railroad actually stopped here in 1878, and it didn't go any further for another year. It gave time for a mercantile business to start along the railroad. People got off and built summer homes here, and artists, writers, performers, they came here and they fell in love with the beauty and the serenity of Saluda, and they came here and they painted and they wrote stories. And we have the best air quality in Western North Carolina. Kid you not, it is good ozone. It is only matched by a small town in Italy with the same type of positive ozone. So when you come to Saluda, you feel good, and you usually don't know it, but it's the air all around you.
I'm Mark Ray. What I think makes Saluda such a unique place to stop and visit or actual destination, all of this happens within about a 3-block area. The depot certainly part of this historic theme. All the buildings now are on the National Historic Registry, so we hope to have, preservation into the future on the special structures, and just the quaintness of the village makes Saluda truly a unique destination. It is a place where time has passed and we've stayed intact.
I think everybody's read or heard something about the Steepest grade, so they come to see if the trains are still going and if they can ride a train. But then if they can't do that, they come in the depot. And it's amazing all the people that have traveled and come to Saluda. We had over 10,000 names registered last year, and today we even had a man from France. So it's wonderful to see people coming to Saluda, come in the depot, and we have a diorama of the grade that shows the 3 miles, and it shows starting where the depot used to sit, down the tracks here, and it shows the towns back in the 1950s, and it takes them down to Melrose, and we can show them the safety tracks. And then we have so much inside the depot that people have just given us. Mark Ray actually came down from Hendersonville and said, we need to save that depot. We need to buy it, save it. There was about 20 of us. We started meeting. This is why Saluda's here, because of the railroad. We'd love for it to come back, but who knows.
Back in 2001, a lot of the traffic patterns were changing. A lot of the management that had been there for a long time that was used to Saluda Grade was starting to retire, and new people were coming in, and they were taking fresh looks at things. And the big thing is that there was so much of Saluda's traffic that could go via Old Fort, via the loops, and then you didn't have to maintain that tremendous grade. They always assigned a supervisor for the train crews to take the trains down the hill. So that's one less job that they've got to do. And so it just made a lot of sense to just, truncate that line on either end of it and just run it as a stub-end branch from either way. But, it had sort of outlived its time. And the fact that you could go a different route that was much, much easier, was a big part of it. Now, the fact that they've kept it is interesting, because obviously what we were all told at the time was that, should the traffic ever be back that would merit keeping that route open, they would bring it back. And I do know that part of the traffic mix that was on that line, there was a lot of export traffic through Charleston that would come from the Midwest. A lot of heavy equipment coming out of Caterpillar in Peoria. And a lot of that would go to export in Charleston. Well, that traffic moved. And Duke Power's coal for Belmont, it could go via Old Fort. And of course, wood chips, which was one of the few upgrade commodities, they don't pay very well. The wood chips are a pretty low revenue commodity, and they could just as easily go through Old Fort. And it's only 60-something miles between Asheville and Spartanburg that way. It's a couple hundred if you go through Salisbury. But like I said, you can combine them with regular trains. And after a while, they figured out the shipping tempo for the paper mill at Canton. So it wasn't such a big deal as far as a supply goes. So the main thing, I think, was just there were alternatives. Saluda was a tough thing. And they could rail bank it and keep it for the future. And it could come back. It would be a lot of fun to see it come back.
Even though the community of Saluda hasn't seen rail traffic in nearly 20 years, one thing remains true today. The railroad has and always will mean something to this community. And thanks to the volunteers of the Saluda Historic Depot Museum, the memory of Saluda Grade will be preserved for generations to come. The next time you're in Saluda, stop by the museum, visit with the volunteers, check out the exhibits, and if you're there on a Friday, stop by for Train Tales to learn more about the rich history of operations on Saluda Grade. There's no telling what the future has in store for Saluda Grade. Norfolk Southern still retains ownership of the right-of-way, and while they don't have any plans to reactivate the line anytime soon, they're still holding on to it just in case they ever need it. We'd like to remind our viewers that if you do visit Saluda, don't hike the grade. It's extremely dangerous and is indeed still railroad property. If you decide to hike the railroad grade, know that you're technically trespassing on railroad property and you're taking your life into your own hands. Saluda Grade is extremely dangerous, with washouts occurring all the way from Melrose to the top of the grade in downtown Saluda. This concludes our first episode of Abandoned Railways here on Delay in Block Productions. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have suggestions for abandoned railways that you'd like to see featured in this series, let me know in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Drayton Blackgrove. We'll see you next time on Abandoned Railways. Happy railroading from all of us at Delay in Block Productions.
Thank you.